So thank you for coming out on this beautiful lunch hour. I'm Kristine Stiphany. I am a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow here at the School of Architecture. And my talk today is about how architecture meets the city and how people influence that interface. So I use geospatial methods to understand where phenomena is happening in the city. So on the left, you see an image of a map of Sao Paulo, Brazil, and where the informal settlements that we'll be talking about are located. So in the dark red, you see loteamentos and favelas. So I use geospatial methods to look at this distribution of phenomena. I also use ethnography to understand the political implications of what is happening in cities and why technological choice occurs the way that it does in particular places and when buildings meet the ground. I've been studying these relationships in Brazilian informal settlements since my tenure as a Fulbright scholar at the University of Sao Paulo in 2008. And then as a project architect for a slum upgrading project in Sao Paulo. Since that time, I've come to recognize that one of the most interesting dimensions of self-building practices, these building practices that structure informal settlements, is not necessarily the unit of housing in itself, but its evolutionary trajectory, so how it changes. But what's been most surprising of late is that in parallel with this emerging data revolution, this urban data revolution, the city is being transformed through the digital tools through which we use to study it. However, those tools have yet to calibrate to the parts of the city that are changing the most. So simply put, my argument is that our urban data revolution needs new inputs, not more inputs. So today I'm going to talk a bit about a project in Brazil where we are attempting to create new data inputs. My preliminary objective has been to grasp a finer grain of data that derives from the built and social environments of informal settlements. So I'm going to structure this talk by first talking about half houses and core houses, these catalysts for informal settlements that we've heard about through our recent Pritzker Prize winner. Talk about the research, the scope, and objectives. I will discuss that, then I will focus the talk most profoundly on the digital tools that I use to link ethnographic and urban methods. I'll then discuss some of the limits of data for interfacing and studying the wicked problems that confront cities in the global south, and offer a few concluding remarks for thinking about how these kinds of methods intersect with design. So who's familiar with half houses? Aravena's half, okay, so which one is the half house? Anyone? It's not a trick, so they're all half houses. Yeah. So even though this model seems, the Aravena's half house is this half house, but they're all half houses. Even though this model seems very innovative and new, it's actually one that was brought online in the 1970s by the World Bank. So this core house appealed to both bottom-up grassroots movements because it involved the incremental construction of housing, as well as to international aid agencies that were looking to develop housing cheaply. So what is known as the mutirão, or self-help, or core and half houses, shaped one of the most significant paradigm shifts in international development for the global south, or third world, or developing world. And it pushed a shift toward the upgrading of informal settlements. So we moved away from displacing and eradicating informal settlements in whole, now we do it in part, but we shifted more toward, development shifted more toward the upgrading of informal settlements. And there are many debates around this topic, but the use of data today is directed toward refining those upgrading approaches. So, but one of the most interesting parts of these core house schemes was that they were not only a technological solution, but designed to be a social solution. And so in many instances, communities, informal settlements that had formed in the 1960s and 70s evolved through the collective construction of housing. And these community associations have evolved over the last 3 decades. And so you can see on the left here, mutirão is autogestão. Autogestão is, it's most significantly situated within the work of Henry Lefebvre, and it really speaks to this idea that came through the 1980s Brazilian urban reform movement, that to build the city is to change the city and develop oneself. And so these community organizations, in many cases, now do different things. They deal with women's rights, they deal with environmental degradation, but the point is that this housing system has evolved social systems over time, and those social systems have changed. What I'm going to argue is that the new form of autogestão relates to the digital movement, yet they lack the tools through which to make those or complete those connections. And so a little context. There are 3 things to know, 4 main things to know about Brazilian informal settlements, just as a background. There are 2 main types, favelas and loteamentos. So you saw those on the map at the beginning. Favelas have an irregular morphological pattern. They're composed of core house structures and simply self-built structures that have not been benefited from any technical assistance. They look like this. This is the Heliópolis favela in Sao Paulo. The second type is called a loteamento. So you can see loteamentos have a much more regular form. Loteamentos were actually the first informal settlements in Sao Paulo. This is different than Rio, where favelas were the first type. But in Sao Paulo, loteamentos emerged in the 1940s, and they're essentially illegally subdivided peripheral settlements. And so a land surveyor went out, subdivided the land, and sold it illegally. So they have they have a more regular morphology. Today, most informal settlements are a hybrid of these 2 types. So the 2 cases that I've been studying for the last 8 years are Heliópolis and Sao Paulo. One is, Heliópolis is an inner ring favela, so it's located 11 kilometers from the city center. São Francisco is a peri-urban situation. It started as a loteamento. It's located 22 kilometers from the city center. But the point of this slide is to show you through the coloring that that these informal settlements have been upgraded successively over the last 30 years. So not only are there 2 different types of informal settlements, they've been successively upgraded by government interventions. And because of political volatility, those upgrading interventions are never the same. They just flip-flop. So this picture this image shows one informal settlement, São Francisco, and the myriad of development approaches that have been applied to the area since the 1980s. So in the foreground, you see these are half houses or core houses. Here and here, these were probably building kits that were provided. And here you would probably have an inner core house that was constructed, and families construct the entire house over time. So this is 1970s, 1980s. These are Singapuras. So the Singapuras coincided with a shift away from self-help in the 1990s toward an urban management approach to development in parallel with neoliberalism and neoliberal restructuring. Here are Singapuras. And then the other development approach, the most recent approach, is called urbanization of favelas. And these are infill boutique housing projects that are inserted within the Singapuras and the self-help. So the larger point is that these are very highly hybrid situations that have been successively upgraded over time. Approximately 50% of all informal settlements in Sao Paulo have been upgraded. So we're not talking anymore about these untouched areas. So the big urban development problem today is that despite the work that has been done in informal settlements on the part of social movements and on the part of the government and on the part of technology and politics, nothing has been evaluated or assessed in its nexus. So we don't know about the relationships between these building types. So there have been studies about the Singapura, about Muchirão, these self-help types, but nothing about their relationships. And so the challenge of consolidated settlements is how to actually build and develop within them when you have such a mix. Which one is the model? There's also a question that people related or studying urban development, international development for decades, have been concerned with the relationship between physically upgrading an area and the extent to which this has not led to connections between residents and broader channels of social mobility. Also, community empowerment. How does redevelopment actually empower people? So the point is that data infrastructures are uneven. The data or the urban development processes aren't capturing this finer grain of data that relate to informal settlements. So this is one quote from Arlecci Persoli, who's down on the right here. And I finished my doctoral work, and she said to me, you know, we need something more concrete to say, look, there's something here, and it needs to be documented. And so these are not, this lack of finer grained, or what I call situated data, is something that's recognized by emerging movements within science technology studies, and it's recognized by the people themselves. And so the research objective of a project that I'm working on right now is to merge empirical data and ethnographic data. So understanding where and what of housing development and what the meaning is. And so as a background to the study is a 2-year postdoctoral grant that I wrote in 2015. And this grant is located here at the School of Architecture, funded by the National Science Foundation. And I chose to work here because the grant permits you to, or wants you to work with 2 mentors. So I have one of my mentors here today, Stephen Moore, and my other mentor is Peter Ward over at the School of Public Policy. So for the last 1.5 years, we've been working together to undertake a project in Sao Paulo. And the objectives are to produce new data or situated data, as well as synthesize the data into spatial forms that can be applied to urban design and development. The research has 3 phases, and I'm not going to focus on all of them, but it began with the community engagement process in 2 communities in Sao Paulo that I've been studying since 2010. It then went into a data collection process and analysis and digital tools phase. So I'm going to constrain my talk to the data collection and analysis and digital tools phase. There are 3 main ways that I'm using digital technologies to study the relationship between housing and cities. So 1, data collection and fieldwork, coding, and application and analytical maps. Data collection and fieldwork involves a combined survey questionnaire and post-occupancy analysis of approximately 1,000 housing units across the 2 settlements that I described earlier, Heliopolis and San Francisco. These areas were chosen because they're the only informal settlements in the city of Sao Paulo that have been upgraded 4 times and are now going to be upgraded a 5th time. So they share that in common. They're very different because of their spatial situation. As I mentioned, one is 10 kilometers from the city center, the other is 22 kilometers. And that extra 12 kilometers makes a world of difference, as I'll talk about it at the end. We used a weighted sample among different development types and a 2-step random selection process to select the housing units. Coding in 2D models helps us to understand the housing patterns and typology studies, and then application and analytical maps are most useful for providing feedback loops between the community partners with whom we're working in the field and also generally, and with the city of Sao Paulo. And so the first, as a backdrop to the digital tools, we first constructed maps using a combined CAD, computer-aided design, and GIS method, where we basically merged these maps that the city has created since 1990 using aerial photography, and then we ground truthed those maps throughout the process. So this map and the one of San Francisco, these have been in construction throughout the entire process. And so you can see here the distribution of the different development types. These are the core housing types here in dark blue, and non-core housing, straight, self-building in light blue. These are those Singapuras and urbanization of favelas. And so this is the Heliopolis favela and the distribution of those development types. And in red, you see the randomly selected blocks. And within those blocks, we randomly selected 8 housing units. We did this randomly. We used random selection to ensure external validity of the sample size. It is highly unusual to use random selection for a study in an informal settlement due to safety issues. We've been very fortunate to work with community organizations and people on the ground who have helped us through this process and did complete the entire data collection process in December, albeit 2 months late. However, the random selection process has really permitted us a very broad understanding of the housing typologies within these 2 areas. And so I'm going to talk about the 3 different steps and ways that I've begun to connect ethnographic research with digital tools. And so the first, data collection. This is an image of, just an image of our field notes, so how we go through the field to understand where we are, what's missing, and what's next. This is a photograph of my field team. And so you'll see 2 research assistants, one from Berkeley and the other from the Escola Cidade in Sao Paulo, Kirsten and Alessandra, and then Barbara and Stephanie and Lua. There are community partners who were with us throughout this process. And so we went door to door and interviewed residents in their own homes, talking to them about how they built their houses and measuring their house for, to understand the physical dimensions of how the house evolved. So this is a photo of a core house in San Francisco. And so the steps in this process of data collection involved 3 primary phases. Field notes, so we had the 2-step random selection, and this is how we documented which houses were selected. Digital reconciliation every single field day. So we would go into a CAD drawing and essentially we would mark which units were selected and draw in areas that were constructed but not shown as constructed in the map. So we would make corrections to the map over time using computer-aided design, which is a tool that has been used by the architecture field since the 1970s. We also had for every housing unit field notes. These field notes were really about the physical space of the house, but also about the respondent. And so they say, I'll find things such as, oh, are you with the city? Are you with a development company? Do you want to take away my home? So we ran across a lot of issues in the field that required quite a bit of sensitivity. Sometimes interviews would take 45 minutes. Sometimes they would take 2 hours because it just depended on respondents' feeling that day and their sense of security and confidence in what we were doing. This led to the step of coding. So each set of field notes and maps, each house that was drawn in the field in axonometric was coded into a 3D model. So at this point, we're shifting from 2D documentation using CAD into the 3D projection of each housing unit and coding those projections according to function and according to social experience, as well as tenure conditions. So what we did was used photographs and then built models of every housing unit. And so here you can see the core housing unit mapped here. Here's one that has not been evolved. And so here's another core housing unit. So you can see the hatch pattern for the core here. So we developed a series of 3D models in order to understand how these houses have evolved over time. We developed the coding guide along with community partners and through trial and error and observation. So this coding guide was in evolution for probably 3 months. And we used the guide to understand mostly ownership. Ownership is something that is very important to development scholars. It's very important to community members because it's related to politics and constituents and social needs. And so that's the issue of ownership and tenure was a common ground for us to really begin to develop our first analysis maps. We then use these 3D models and move them into a program called Rhino with a V-Ray plugin, which is a rendering plugin. And so what we did with the initial codes is you attach a material to that code. So for example, we have a house with a house that has 3 owners. The third owner is renting out the back of their unit. And so we began to code all of the spaces using Rhino and V-Ray in order to visualize them so that we begin to have conversations with our community partners about what was going on and understand amongst ourselves how these places were evolving. And so here you see there's a section for owner and commercial, common circulation here. The pink is a space it's in construction. And so we began to develop a series of tenure typologies. So you have an original owner, someone who's just evolved their house over years and it's only their family living there. An absentee owner, all rental. This is starting to happen more and more and is fairly concerning because it's generating highly precarious rental situations. Owner and rental at the bottom. So this is the most common typology where you see an owner who has evolved his or her home over time. Children move out and they transfer that space into a rental situation and in many cases we'll put a street front shop at the front. So that's one of the most common typologies we're seeing. We also mapped these typologies according to time and experience. And so you see here the original core house from 1993, 2 additional bedrooms, the second floor is constructed, 2-room rental unit, open air laundry. And so you begin to see how these houses evolve over time. And so we used the interface between CAD, which is in 2D, Rhino, which is in 3D, and V-Ray, which is a rendering tool, in order to begin to visualize these changes across the 1,000 or so housing units that were surveyed. And so what does all of this mean? How do we actually apply this data to an urban strategy? So one of the things, as I mentioned, one of the most concerning issues for community development is tenure. And so this map is one of our first analytical maps. It's focused on the distribution of ownership. And so in orange, you can begin to see the surveyed lots. And in green, you see an owner extended family rental. So these are owners who have added a rental unit. Red, absentee owner, original owner in the gray, and 2 or more owners in an extended family in the light blue. And so the most interesting or thing that stands out most in this kind of analytical map is that while there's quite a bit of difference across informal settlements, within blocks, they're fairly similar. So you see a lot of similarity between these 2 blocks here, and they're beginning to group. Another issue that we begin to see is this, when we survey an absentee rental owner, that the rental conditions are fairly precarious, and more often than not, the respondent is a single mother and of the lowest income realm. And so we're starting to really look at how can rental situations or housing situations begin to accommodate these kinds of very, very vulnerable situations, but also beautify the physical space of informal settlements. And so the next step in this research is to translate and synthesize all of this data into a series of urban strategies for redeveloping the 2 communities we've studied. And so this drawing shows an area within Heliopolis here, it corresponds to the map that I just showed. And this area is called Lagoa, and it borders the Mutirão area. So this is a historical zone within Heliopolis, and this is an area that is just as old. However, it evolved without any technical assistance from the state. And so these two neighborhoods within this neighborhood are quite divided. There's, on one side, the people in the Mutirão would like to remove all of Lagoa, and the people in Lagoa would like those in the Mutirão to move themselves. And so there's quite a bit of tension between these two sub-neighborhoods within Heliopolis. So what our plan is to use two different technologies as a way to begin to analyze and visualize different options through which these two sub-communities might begin to develop a discourse around a common future. And so we'll use Envision Tomorrow, which is a planning tool used to analyze different land use scenarios. So for example, Envision Tomorrow works very differently than CAD or Rhino, where you're focusing on a building. But Envision Tomorrow works where you basically use the data from the housing typologies to create idealized building types. So in our world, that might be mixed use. And then you select an area and you paint over that area. And you say, okay, what would happen financially if we develop this area according to mixed use? So instead of using the mixed use typology that we'd use in the United States, we're going to build building typologies based on the data that we've developed in Brazil for Envision Tomorrow. So essentially run analyses based on building types and housing types that come from historical precedents. And then the second step of this is to use Rhino or 3D analysis to begin to design typologies that will accommodate our different tenure structures. So owners who would like to build a rental unit, or single mothers who need a small space for a cheap price, or these younger people who are looking to move out of their parents' home. So we're looking to begin to use 3D studies to develop these urban strategies that will work within informal settlements. So what is the limit to data? When I started the talk, I showed you two different settlements, Heliopolis and San Francisco. San Francisco started with the same core housing scheme in the 1970s. They had the same development approaches. However, the outcomes have been much different. Their community organization is much weaker, much more fragmented. They have the same organized crime. The organized crime in San Francisco involves much more infighting. So it's a very precarious situation. And what's happened in terms of housing is that there's been quite a bit of resettlement. And so I'll show you an example. This is San Francisco in 2008. So just keep your eye on the soccer field and the area to the left of it. 2011, that area is removed. And last month, this is what it looks like again. So this shows essentially that where data, which was used to develop this area in this image, is falling short, because what's happening is that there are no data infrastructures to begin to accommodate what happens when nothing is done by the state in the meantime. So when you have these political volatilities, communities have no way of protecting what has already been done, and so you begin up repeating the same patterns. That's one limit of data, and that involves political will, not data. And so we have a couple of different things to think about in terms of data limits generally. Rental markets, so you have the peri-urban conditions like this. This is a classic case of a peri-urban condition. So you have rental markets that are generating very different fluxes. These rental markets come from the last development type, urbanization of favelas. When Sao Paulo started using rental vouchers, it's pushing up the rents and causing gentrification processes within inner ring informal settlements and pushing people out to the periphery. So So you have absentee owners within the inner core settlements and squatters in peripheral areas. The second issue in terms of thinking about an urban strategy is that all of this development is creating isolated enclaves. This is not only the state coming in and putting a fence around things. And one of the questions for individuals who are seeking to move to a new location is, what will the first upgrade you will do to your home? What will you do? What will you build when you get there? These are self-builders who have evolved along with social movements since the 1970s. The first thing they're doing is building a wall or a fence. So that tells us that there are serious issues with security. People who are relying on organized crime to secure things in their communities are also quite scared and looking to move out. So you're having this general flow of flights out of informal settlements. This has been fueled by and fanned by greater access to credit and peripheral housing estates. In Brazil, this is called Minha Casa Minha Vida. It's been in implementation since 2009. And so what's happening is that when you look at these self-built patterns whereby families in the 1980s and 90s would build their homes, their children would build their homes, and the house would evolve according to this expanded family structure, that's not happening anymore. So we also did interviews with 100 people moving to Minha Casa Minha Vida settlements or housing estates. And these are all 20, 30-year-old kids who don't want to live with their families. They have consolidated homes. They're homes that they're in low-income neighborhoods, but they're far from being very precarious situations. They simply don't want to live in these consolidated settlements anymore. And so it's creating a even more peripheral shift to peri-urban situations and creating conditions of environmental degradation, spatial segregation. So these are irrational choices because these people understand very well that there's going to be financial hardship, greater distances to get to work. However, the conditions within informal settlements are so poor that they're willing to take those risks. So the question for scholars and designers is, maybe it's not about data. And if it's not about data, then maybe it's about design. And so digital tools will continue to change the city, but their efficacy really depends on the extent to which they interface with design and the extent to which designers use that data not to determine, but to inform design choices. So we're making urban space about people. It's really about creating spaces in informal settlements, again, that are not data-driven, but are spaces where people really want to be. But if design can account for social behavior, the resonance will be much more applicable to what people are actually doing right now in informal settlements. We've had many studies of informal settlements since the 1960s, 70s, but there are very, very different trends happening right now. And so it's one of the things that data can help us do is to be very realistic about what is actually happening. Data and design matter together. You can't have one without the other anymore. I was at a conference in November and French designers said, well, we can't possibly design housing anymore because we don't know the market. We have no idea what's going to be happening. And my argument is that we know what's going to happen. The point is that we really need to pay attention to what's actually happening so that we're beginning to design for reality. That is it. Thank you. Yeah? Sorry? No. We look at investment, original investment, and what they think they can sell the house for right now. So we have those two benchmarks. And investment over time in upgrading.
From my experience, what happens is that when you invest in such places, like the transformation value, actually are increasing the value of your house. So instead of when you buy a house here, you make an investment, so you can sell it for more.
Right.
But here, the opposite.
think it also depends on place in the city, because I think what you're suggesting would definitely hold for San Francisco in this peri-urban situation. But in Heliopolis and in this inner ring, inner core area, property values are rising. I mean, when you're, all of the incremental upgrading has caused significant amounts of gentrification, things like that. People are getting pushed out of rental situations in these areas. The rental subsidies of the last 8 years have set the baseline rent at about 500 reais, when it was 200 reais a year before. So it's really jumped. So the government is continuing to pass out these subsidies, and it's essentially excluding a lot of people who could live in these settlements for a while. Property owners? I'm finding that the absentee rental owners are. So those people who have evolved the house and they've just turned it over to renters and they're living somewhere else. So those are the most precarious situations. Now, the original owners who have built a couple of rental units on the back of their home, they evolve those spaces along with the other renovations that they do to their house. But it's the absentee owners, absentee rental slumlords, who are the most concerning in areas like Heliopolis. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you tell us about what distinguishes Heliopolis? What constitutes the border between it and whatever is next to it?
Let's see if I can find. Yes. So Heliopolis, it was a blank site owned by the state up until the 1960s. It started, this area here looked like this. It started in the 1960s. The government was building a viaduct, moved 100 families to this area, to temporary housing, never built the new housing, and now it's this. So Heliopolis has evolved within a working class neighborhood. This is Sacomã, so it's what you would see maybe out in East Austin. It's low density single family housing here. This area to the north is the Tamanduateí district. That district is the city of Sao Paulo's central planning focus right now. And so it's very concerning for Heliopolis. And one of the cases we're attempting to make through this study is that this new Tamanduateí development project could essentially use lessons from the housing within Heliopolis to build social housing for that development. They've committed to 20,000 units, but there's no design for it. So Heliopolis is bordered by middle income, working class neighborhood, and a district that is going to be turned over to private developers over the next 10 years. So it's in a precarious situation.
What are the levels of density surrounding Heliopolis?
So here they're fairly similar. I mean, here you're going to find an occasional tower, but it's 2 to 3 levels of housing. And within Heliopolis, some blocks are, I've seen 5 to 6 story houses, but mostly you're talking between 2 and 3 stories. So within Heliopolis. But it's dense it's one of the densest informal settlements in Sao Paulo. It's the largest, so.
Have you done any comparisons in terms of people developing their homes in those other districts?
No, I would love to. No, my comparison has focused upon a very small favela in Sao Paulo's northern sector, another peri-urban situation, and then between Heliopolis and San Francisco. But that would be a very interesting study. Yeah. Yeah, Jake. Uh-huh.
I was interested in how you ended your presentation talking about how data should be integrated with design. The data should include data about social attributes of the community I was just wondering, I don't know if you've gotten to this point yet in your research, but what would it look like if this kind of approach were to be scaled up, or how would that happen? 'Cause, I mean, this is an extremely impressive project. It's a ton of work. It's very labor intensive, I would imagine. It's very complex to visit these 1,000 properties or however many it was. And I guess what I'm wondering is, if your call were to be heeded, do you see a way that this sort of analysis could become routinized, or could become just part of the normal standard operating procedure?
I mean, that's a great question. So the next step is to use the 3D Rhino models to develop a series of typologies that correspond to, and we also measure, we have a 5-point scale for measuring the consolidation of a house. If it's very consolidated, if it's very precarious. And so for matching typology to level of consolidation, and then using 3D modeling to develop typologies, and then repeat those. So that would be one way to scale up, but use that in tandem with something like Envision Tomorrow, so you could begin to measure the financial implications for those.
Once you have the types, then it begin that you could do it a lot quicker, I suppose, because you use the types in a short.
Well, I hope so. Yeah. So the idea is to develop a series of typologies, maybe 5 to 10 from these 1,000, and then load those into Envision Tomorrow as a building type, and then paint that over areas. And so the first test bed will be that district that I showed at the end, the Lagoa district within Heliopolis, and then the second area would be the Tamanduatei district. So the city is very interested in using the data for the Tamanduatei district. So right now, that's the goal, is to scale it. Yeah.
You're working from sort of doing this level of analysis, which forms typology and typology forms kind of gets the overall configuration. Are you working from the other direction, so more from a kind of conventional urban design perspective, where you're thinking about the kind of hierarchies, social spaces, and typology sort of the end, as opposed to working from the typology and kind of creating city. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, so what is your process in terms of thinking about the overall system, well, kind of how social and more private spaces should be organized in relation to each other?
I'm not, at this point I am not, but that is part of the next stage of analyzing the typologies, is to begin to look at how those expand into district scales. So the strategy that I'm proposing for Heliopolis is to work on a district scale that encompasses 2 to 3 blocks, because of the differences between blocks and similarities within them. And so the idea would be to use something like Envision Tomorrow to begin to create a series of districts within informal settlements that have historical boundaries. Heliopolis, I studied its historical boundaries for my dissertation research. So it has districts that have been established for the last 30 years. This would be using the study of housing to begin to work on street level, streetscape, and district level improvements. Some would involve the creation of parks and some removal, but in the case of Heliopolis, they have quite a bit of open land, so it's possible to build new housing on that land. In that case, removal would be a viable option. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I think regarding what Jake said, and I think you're going particularly the right direction. But this basically is code. It's code enforcement because that's the way you can preserve the values and maintain something like condition. So what this basically is that never had was code
I think that's a great comment, and building upon that, I think there's a movement within design and urbanism to romanticize ad hocism and incrementalism in these areas. And what we're finding is that people have lived with that for many years. They're used to the incremental at the political scale, and they're used to these small projects on a household scale or lot scale. And so one of the things that was so invigorating for many people with whom we've spoken about the Muchidao and these self-help approaches is that someone had a vision and said, this is what's going on. And so it wasn't about everyone coming together and everyone coming to some sort of consensus. It was about some normative vision saying, this is a possibility based on what we know about your social situation for this area. Now, I'm not advocating, I don't believe that the core house should be replicated en masse for its density problems, the fact that people don't want to self-build anymore. I don't believe that that's a model that we should be replicating, especially across Brazil. But I do think there is something to a normative vision and using digital tools as a way to visualize that vision, to begin to create discourse through image, through representation that's related to urban change.
In terms of planning, modeling future development, in terms of helping the residents understand the implications, the impacts of different choices, have you talked to people about what they really care about in terms of, like you mentioned, housing costs would be one, but in terms of what the software is able to give them in terms of information about, you know, if we go this way, these might be some benefits that you actually really respond to. Have you done any brainstorming or?
Yes, I mean, one of the things, I'm analyzing the data in pieces, and so I've been really focused on the people who are opting into these Minha Casa Minha Vida programs. I'm mapping the existing conditions, where they live now, their house, their neighborhood, and where they're going to go to in the next 5 years, where they are expected to and want to go in the next 5 years. And so some of the things I'm seeing debunk a lot of what I thought about design and community development. They want, well, this part is not, they want security like everyone else, but they want walls, fences, those kinds of things. They want their own space. And even when financial hardship, even when they have the data, that financial hardship will increase, that commute will double, and that they will be isolated from social services, they're still making that, they're still opting for that program. And that is something that, this is the forthcoming article that I'm working on with Peter Ward, and so those are hard things to look at. But in terms of those who want to stay within informal settlements, I think something like a planning tool that works on street level improvements that deal with trees, that deal with commerce, creating a little bit more evenness within districts about, related to commerce and access would be, because some areas have not one store, other areas have 10. So there's quite a bit of internal unevenness. So those would be, I think, security, commerce, social services. Anything else? Thanks for coming.